Welcome to the special report with Areva Martin, where we tackle today's most pressing issues with deep insight and expert analysis. This is the show you turn to when you want your news unfiltered, where we give you the information and resources you need while separating fact from fiction. Well, you may have seen in the Los Angeles Times that federal law enforcement agents are planning to carry out a large-scale immigration enforcement in the Los Angeles area before the end of February. Now, this is according to some internal government documents that were reviewed by the Los Angeles Times. The operation, which would be spearheaded by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, will focus on people, according to this report, who do not have legal status in the country or who already have pending orders of removal. Now, thousands flocked to downtown Los Angeles in recent days to engage in demonstrations against Trump's mass deportation strategies. Protesters briefly blocked the 101 freeway. That happened over the last week. And unfortunately, a person was actually stabbed during a fight near Spring Street during some of the demonstrations that took place. Today, we're going to continue our conversations about the impact of Trump's immigration policies and ICE raids, that is, the raids by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement agencies. These raids have put the fear of God in some undocumented workers and in some immigrants who are here legally. We're hearing reports that folks are not showing up to work, they're not showing up to school, they're not taking their kids to school, they're not even showing up for Sunday worship services. What is going to happen to millions of undocumented workers across this country as Trump continues the promises that he made on the campaign trail? And as these immigration enforcement actions intensify, undocumented workers, many who contribute billions of dollars to industries like agriculture and construction and hospitality, are being detained. And many are being forced into the shadows, living in fear each and every day. Employers are also feeling the squeeze, with labor shortages threatening productivity, particularly here in Los Angeles, where thousands have been burned out of their homes as a result of brush fires. Many are asking the question, how can Los Angeles rebuild tens of thousands of structures, particularly if undocumented workers are afraid to come outside? When we come forward, we're going to break all of this down, what it means to undocumented workers, what it means to businesses across this country, and what it means to future immigration policies right here on the special report.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Joining us for our continuing conversation about the raids, the planned raids that are happening in cities around this country, and now a big raid that's planned for the end of February for the Los Angeles area, is Veronica Cardenas. She is a former ICE prosecutor and founder of the firm called Humanizing. She decided, after working under three presidential administrations, that she could best serve undocumented workers in her own firm. Thank you so much, Veronica, for joining us. I know that you are an immigration lawyer, have been one for a while, and that you've been working on behalf of undocumented workers. You are also a daughter of immigrants. So help us understand what the community of folks that you serve, how are they feeling in this moment when they hear about these raids that have taken place in places like Chicago, and now this planned raid by ICE on the Los Angeles community?
Right. Thank you so much for having me here. And I think that what this administration is doing is creating a lot of fear so that people, non-citizens, whatever their status is, they throw their hands up and they say it's better to just go home. We see the reports on their Instagram, on TikTok, on Twitter of non-citizens in handcuffs. And a lot of them are people who just overstayed their visas, people who are trying to work. And so when we hear these raids happening, people are afraid of being detained. Detention centers are not pleasant situations. People are placed into solitary confinement. They don't have enough to eat. The conditions are very cold. It's even difficult for them to seek medical attention. And so publicizing those difficulties, a lot of people are in fear that if they are arrested, how long will they be detained? Can they be released? Can they proceed with a immigration court proceeding outside of the detention center? And so a lot of the people that are coming into my office that, and when I do talks at community centers, churches, they're all scared. Am I someone who the government is looking for? And that is a very difficult question to answer right now, because Trump and the administration has said they are focusing on criminal non-citizens. They are focusing on people who have an order of deportation already, and they've overstayed that. But what they're showing, what we're seeing on the ground, is a different story, especially because memos like the sensitive location memo was rescinded, where people were not, officers were not allowed to go into schools or churches or hospitals, because there was this understanding that people in our communities need a place to worship, right? They should have that right. They need the ability to seek medical assistance if they're sick. They need to know that they can call 911 or report a crime if something happens against them. And all of those things have been taken away. So this administration has just been instilling a lot of fear, and that's what I am seeing with our clients.
So, Veronica, what legal rights does someone have that doesn't fall into one of those categories? Like, I have not committed a crime. The person is not a criminal. They don't have an order of deportation, but yet they get swept up in one of these raids. I have a friend who runs a nonprofit, and she said she did a YouTube video, and I talked to other friends about this situation where someone has a prior criminal record, and they were lured out of their home and then arrested, detained. So if you're not someone who has, an active felony or warrant against you, do you have any legal rights?
Yeah, and so that is common. So people, non-citizens, even if they committed a crime, everyone still has the same right. Number one, immigration cannot just go into your home without a judicial warrant. More than 90% of the cases, I would say, immigration does not have a judicial warrant signed by a judge. So they're relying on two things. They're relying on the person to give them consent to open the door and say, yes, please come in. And they can get that consent by lying to people. And I don't think people understand that. They can say, hey, there's a package for you waiting outside. Can you open the door? Or, hey, I saw someone just hit your car. Is it your car? You should come out. Or we're investigating a crime. Can we just want some details. And so that's how they lure people to open the door. And then once the door's open, now you cross that threshold. They can either come inside, even though you don't specifically say it, or they arrest you once you cross the threshold of the door. And so knowing that if someone knocks on the door and you're not expecting anybody, do not answer. I'm telling my clients, pretend you're not even home, because once you start engaging, that's a slippery slope, and we don't know where it's going to end. If they have a judicial warrant, they're going to come in anyway. Whether you open the door or not, they're already allowed to do that, so there's no need to engage. When you're out in the public, your rights are a little different there, because you can be approached, but immigration needs to have reasonable suspicion to actually stop you, suspicion that you're violating an immigration law. And so they can't determine that based on the way you look, because you're speaking a different language. And so just understanding that in these times, remaining silent is your best friend.
So, Veronica, you've worked under 3 different administrations. So you've seen from the inside what the immigration system looks like. What's the difference that you've seen as a prosecutor, a former ICE prosecutor under the Trump administration versus under some of the Democratic presidential administrations that you've worked under?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because I think what some people take for granted is, oh, there's these criminals, oh, there's these child abusers, oh, there's these sex traffickers, we have to get them now. And that has always been a constant in immigration. There's always been a priority for people who have violated criminal laws, who are dangers to the public. That has always been a constant, no matter if it was Obama, Biden. Obama at one point had the name deporter in chief because he had removed the most criminal non-citizens. So what's different about this environment is that there's a one-size-fits-all type of immigration. Trump is using a cannon to kill a mouse, if you will. He is using the same force of laws to go after dangerous people, and he's using that against children. He's using that against families. People have been in the U.S. for more than 10 years. I've seen so many people come to my office and say, I came into the United States in the 80s. I came in the 90s. I have just been working. My whole life is here. Am I safe? And that is the difference we're seeing now, that to this administration, just by being here, that is a crime that's going to have severe penalties.
Yeah, I want to bring Professor Jody Vallejo into the conversation. She's a professor at USC of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity. She's the director, also associate director, that is, of Equity Research Institute at USC. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Vallejo. I'm thinking about the fires in Los Angeles. Every time you turn on the television, if you live here in Southern California, you pick up the newspaper, there's some story about the mass, the enormity, I should say, of rebuilding the Pacific Palisades and the Altadena community after the brush fires that destroyed so much of those communities. We know that undocumented workers play such a big role in the construction industry here in SoCal. What would that rebuild process look like if literally at the end of February, hundreds, if not thousands, of undocumented workers are caught up in these raids that are planned for Los Angeles?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for shedding light on these really important issues. I mean, the economic fallout is significant. And as Veronica was mentioning, so is the social fallout of these policies and the impact on our communities, on our family structures, in our schools. The undocumented immigrants who are embedded in our communities, immigrants who were significantly affected by the fires themselves, either because they lived in neighborhoods where the fires were, they worked in industries where the fires were, they worked for people who were affected by the fires. They are crucial to the rebuilding of our city. And it is going to be a significant impact on just the availability of the labor force if these kinds of mass deportation or detention raids actually play out in Los Angeles. We've already seen via organizations like Endelon, the National Day Labor Organizing Network, who has had people that work with their organization who are undocumented becoming certified to clean up after the fires. They have been out there volunteering, cleaning, doing all kinds of work to give back to the community, all free of charge, just to try to show the impact that undocumented people have in our city. I mean, we've already seen the economic fallout and impact and the way it's affecting individuals, and it is just going to spill over into every facet of our society.
So, Veronica, the professor raises a good point. So a lot of undocumented workers are trying their best to demonstrate that they should be allowed to stay in this country. They pay taxes, they volunteer when there's a disaster like the fires. Is there a legal process that exists today that would allow someone who either came here illegally to become legal, or if someone came here legally and overstayed their visa and now they're technically illegal, is there any process to change their status from illegal to legal?
So that is a really great point. And I think that's one of the misconceptions. A lot of people say, right, the argument against this is, you wait online. I did things the right way. But for many people who are here, who want to come here seeking asylum, there really is no quote unquote line or right way to do things. The immigration system has been built on 1800, 1900 type of thinking, and it's designed to exclude, not include. And so unless someone already has an immediate family member here, like a parent, a spouse, and sometimes children I'm going to put aside for now, because there's this argument that, you know, people come here to just have children and then they use their children to get status. That's not exactly true. Parents who have crossed through the border without a visa are actually not eligible to become a lawful permanent resident based on their children, even if they're U.S. citizens. And they definitely are not able to do that when their children are minors. So the whole family is vulnerable to a deportation order at that point. And so the options for going through a legal process, it is very limited. There's humanitarian purposes, which includes asylum, which Trump has really stripped down to like razor thin bones. And then there's family-based, where you have to have a qualifying relative.
So let me ask you this, Veronica. If you come here without legal status and you have a family member here, is there any way that that family member can, quote unquote, vouch for you to help you get legal status?
It's essentially boiled down to just having a spouse. If you come here and you have someone who you're married to or a parent, they can do that process for you, but you do have to leave the United States, because you can't do that process within the United States if you entered without a visa.
So if you came here without a visa, and you meet someone and you're going to marry that person, that you have to go back to your country of origin to get work on coming legally with a visa to marry your spouse or your future spouse.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to clear that up, because I think, as you said, a lot of people believe that there is some legal process by which someone who came here without a visa can then get a visa once they're here. Or that if you've overstayed your visa, that somehow you can overcome that. And you're saying there are very limited circumstances in which that would even happen.
Right. And I think another misconception, a big one, is that seeking asylum is not a lawful pathway. And that is just not true, because the only way to seek asylum is if you make it to the U.S., if you step foot on U.S. soil. That is the only way to request asylum. There's no other way to do it. And so there was a process, there is a process for that, and that has been really a lot of the rights and the procedures for that have been taken away.
So, Professor, that means hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are here undocumented have no real hope of ever changing their status to legal. So where does that leave them in terms of our society? Will they always live in the shadows? Because from what Veronica is saying, Trump has made it very difficult for you to claim any kind of humanitarian status or asylum. So basically, it doesn't seem very hopeful for millions of these undocumented workers.
Yeah, this is something that's really important to understand. And the reception of undocumented people can really vary by states, for example. So there's no national policies in the United States that even support the integration of documented people into the US, as there are in other industrialized nations. And so in the US context, it's really been left up to the states to figure out how to treat undocumented people. And in California, we live in a state that has tried to create as much of a rights-based system as possible for undocumented people. California has been at the forefront. California decriminalized driving without a license for undocumented people. California has allowed undocumented youth to have access to funding for schools, for education. California has decriminalized access to health care in order to try to really essentially, what scholars argue, give a state level measure of citizenship to undocumented people so that people don't have to hide in the shadows, so that people can participate fully in life as much as possible, so that people can feel like they are contributing to society as they are, so that people can support the education of their children born in the US. We have not had any kind of immigration policy in the US that provides a pathway to citizenship until 1986 through the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And so that's why, as Veronica mentioned earlier, we have such a large number of undocumented people who have lived in this country for 10 years or longer, for decades. They live in mixed status families where their
Hold
children...
on, Professor, did that 1986 legislation, federal legislation, create a pathway? And if so, how many people, did it create that pathway for?
Well, that 1986 legislation allowed for people who were undocumented in the country at the time to adjust their status. And so it was essentially an amnesty for people who were undocumented at the time in the country. About 2.5 million people adjusted their status. Many were Latinos, but not everybody was Latino. There were a lot of, for example, Iranians who were living undocumented in the country and adjusted their status under the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And you can actually look, we actually have research which shows parents who were able to adjust their status under IRCA, who were able to become legal citizens of the United States, increased their economic stability. I show in my research that it created a pathway into the middle class for Latinos. I studied the Latino middle and upper classes. We see that people whose parents authorized their status under 1986 do better in school, they do better in society. So there are real benefits to providing a pathway to legalization for people who come to this country and who are presently living here who are undocumented.
So Veronica, you have California, as the professor just told us, creating these ways in which undocumented people can be integrated into our society. They can drive, they can enroll their kids in school, they can show up at a hospital, get health care, and none of that's subjecting them to any kind of immigration, action, in terms of detention. So you have folks in California who have taken advantage of all of these, state laws to be integrated, but yet you have the federal law saying if you are out driving, if you're going to school, if you're actively participating in your community, you are subjecting yourself to being, arrested and detained and deported. So I would imagine that your clients who have been availing themselves of these California generous, what some would call generous policies, have the most to worry about. They're not the people who've been living completely in the shadows. They've been openly participating in their communities because California told them to do so.
Right. And I think that's one of the battles between the federal government versus the states, and this term of sanctuary city that people are throwing around like it's a dirty term. And sanctuary city just means that the government, the state and local governments are protecting all their citizens despite their status. And so, letting them know that you can participate in our community. And a great example of that is the use of DACA and DACA's creation and how it really helped children who had come to the United States who were going to school. I've talked to many people who their salaries have jumped so much just by getting that piece of paper saying you can legally work here because...
So Veronica, explain to folks who perhaps don't know what DACA did.
So DACA was deferred action. So it's a temporary based protection where people renew if they had been in the country at a certain age and they qualified for DACA. So, but they have to renew every 2 years, and it's not a lawful pathway. It's not a means to a lawful pathway for status here. And so even things like that, this administration has not wanted to move forward in creating a legal pathway for DACA holders. And so
DACA just allowed you to be in the country without deportation, but you were never going to become a citizen.
Right. Right. And so they have to pay expensive fees every 2 years to renew that status.
And how many many people have that DACA status approximately?
I'm not sure of the numbers right now. The numbers keep lessening. People who have a way to get permanent status have been doing that. And since there's no new applicants, because that has been paused and gone through many layers of litigation, it's only like a core few that still have that. That number has been lowered. I don't know the exact number though.
Okay, so it's no longer available. So it's not like you can go and apply for DACA status.
Right. Right. And then with the sanctuary city, we see the federal government, taunting and threatening states that are protecting all their citizens and stating that if you interfere with our operations, with our actions, you will be sanctioned. So there is that, that battle going on right now.
Is it legal, Veronica, for states like Texas and some other states that are, all in on Trump's MAGA immigration statuses or policies, I should say? Is it legal for them to use local law enforcement as, the equivalent of ICE agents? So if a local police officer comes to your house, say it's for a routine call, can they detain you and turn you over to ICE?
So that is an excellent point, because what they're doing is deputizing local and state officials to enforce immigration laws. And there is a process for that. It's a 6-month training process. They go through it, they get deputized. But it's important to understand that those officers are still bound by the immigration laws. So if they're going to a person's house to arrest them, they can't say that they have a state warrant or a judicial warrant to go into that house. They are bound by the same laws that immigration officers are bound by. If they conduct a traffic stop, they cannot stop the car and then ask them immediately for their for status of their immigration status. They cannot do that. They are still bound by the laws. In order to start that conversation, they have to articulate what is their reasonable suspicion. And again, it can't be done on race or because they're speaking a different language. It can't be done on discriminatory grounds.
So, Professor Vallejo, we know that undocumented workers pay billions of dollars of taxes, and your colleague told us in the last show that the reason many of them do that is because they're, again, trying to demonstrate that they are, good contributing members of the U.S. economy. And if there ever is an opportunity, I guess, to apply for legal status, they want to be able to demonstrate that they've paid taxes, that they've been, productive members of society. But I don't know, it feels rather, like duplicitous on the part of the U.S. and companies to take taxes from these workers, knowing that the possibility of legal status is remote to none, and that paying your taxes doesn't improve your positioning in terms of this, invisible line, or this line that Veronica says doesn't even exist.
Yes, it's absolutely duplicitous. And I think it's a demonstration of the fact that the way in which the tax base is funded has increasingly fallen on the hands of working people and the middle class in our society. Might I just add that Tesla paid $0 in taxes last year. And you see this desire by the Trump administration, by this administration, to constantly criminalize and dehumanize, to criminalize the act of immigration, to criminalize and dehumanize who immigrants are, to make it easier to exploit immigrants in the labor market, in our labor force, in the labor market that full sectors that completely rely on immigrants to uphold our entire economy, not just our economic sectors, but Medicare, Social Security, the kinds of financial sums, the vast amounts of money that immigrants pay in at the state, at the local, regional, and state level, and then of course at the federal level. And what's also really disheartening is the fact that immigrants are so much more than just their economic contributions and the risks to our economy that are going to be posed by detention and deportation, which, again, right now, presently, this government does not have the manpower or the funds to carry out their promises. That's why they're targeting sanctuary cities. That's why they're trying to deputize local police via 287G agreements or other kinds of agreements like Veronica was just mentioning. That's precisely why they're going to attack sanctuary states. And so it is absolutely demonstrative of the kinds of exploitation that can occur when you racialize a group as inhuman, not worthy of being a part of a country, not worthy of reaping the benefits of citizenship. It's very duplicitous.
So, Veronica, I remember when Ron DeSantis was running for president, or maybe it was in the context of one of his, governor's races, that there was a Republican business owner. He owned a chain of restaurants in Florida. He had been a big supporter of Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. And then there was a raid on his restaurants. And one of the workers caught up in the raid was someone who had worked for him for over a decade, who he had gotten to be personal friends with. I mean, it was almost like a member of his family. And he was so livid about this individual who was caught up in this raid. And he really changed his position. He came out against the raids. He came out against the immigration policies that Ron DeSantis and Trump were supportive of. And I just query, how come we don't see more companies, business owners, CEOs that have workers like this business owner has, that have provided them with the ability to run massive companies, to make, millions, if not billions in profit? They know that their companies, their warehouses, their restaurants, their farms cannot operate without this labor force. Why do you think we don't see more of them speaking up against these policies?
I think that's a great point. I think that having non-citizens as the political scapegoats has always worked in this nation's favor, and that's why they have so very little rights when it comes to the legal system. And the truth is, the reality is, people think it doesn't affect them. They think because I'm a U.S. citizen, maybe because, we saw some people from Venezuela who had TPS, they didn't think that it would affect them. People think that this does not affect them. But the reality is, many employers, even though they're not supposed to, they do rely on undocumented workers because their labor is cheaper. They don't have as many rights. And so for non-citizens, they are the scapegoats, and they also are getting taken advantage of by so many people because they don't have those rights, those legal rights, those protections. And I think that we don't see enough of that because they're maybe being compensated in other ways. The employers, we've seen this when immigration goes into a factory, into a place, and they're arresting the non-citizens who are there. But what sanctions does the employer get? They can negotiate their sanctions, and I'm going to pay this. No, I want to pay this. Okay, let's meet somewhere in the middle. And then they walk away scot-free. They can rehire new undocumented workers to come in and replace, and that's the way that, business as usual for them.
So, Professor Vallejo, we know that undocumented workers, particularly I think the quote was 1 in 5 family members, there may be an individual that is undocumented in, immigrant families. Do you feel like we're seeing enough support for undocumented workers by those immigrants that have legal status? Because, that's the question when we see huge numbers, or bigger, I won't say huge, but bigger numbers of voters, Latino voters in particular, breaking for Donald Trump in this last election. Just begs the question about, is there robust support for undocumented workers and policies that favor them from those immigrants that have gotten legal status?
That's such a good question. And you see different patterns within immigrant communities themselves. I will just say that the Trump voters within the Latino community were more likely to be men and more likely to be lower educated men. And so it wasn't Latinos overall, broad swath of Latinos that voted for Trump. There were gender and race and class intersections there. We know Trump appealed to many lower educated men, regardless of race. And I think a lot of people are now didn't really understand what they were voting for and are coming to have some buyer's remorse. And so you see two patterns in the community. You see where sometimes people that don't want to be associated with a criminalized, dehumanized, racialized group might feel like they need to reject their ethnic identity or try to integrate into the community that has more social, political, and economic power. This country has always, immigration law in this country has always been embedded in maintaining white supremacy, as has access to rights and the access to really political, social, and economic power. And so some people will try to make a claim to that. But we have seen a significant amount of activism within immigrant communities. You mentioned earlier the vast protests that have been happening every single day in Los Angeles. I work on the ground here in Orange County with immigrant rights activists and community members, and we are seeing every day families who have never been activated before, who are not immigrants themselves, standing up, wanting to walk with immigrant communities and support immigrant communities in ways that I thought might never be possible. And so there is a lot of activism right now. People are working in small little ways, people are working in big ways. And I think that we'll continue to see more of this. And one of the things that these racializing policies do, the political rhetoric, the laws do, is they can activate a sense of community. They can activate a sense of ethnicity, a sense of wanting to come together as a community among people who might not have been involved regardless. And so we are seeing so many people and families, I think, stand up in ways that has been really amazing to me as a researcher and as an activist in communities.
So I'll ask you this, Veronica, because you have experienced this both as a professional, a lawyer, a prosecutor inside of ICE, but you're also the daughter of immigrants. And it feels like we have more work to do to humanize the stories of folks like your parents and other guests that we've had on the show. How do we do that?
I think the first thing is educating. There's so much distance between us as a nation, right? So Trump administrations can only go so far if he didn't have the support. The truth is he does have support within some communities, and closing the gap on that distance. A lot of people don't understand that, when you talk about economic arguments and you spoke briefly about taxes, that non-citizens, the first thing they do when they get to this country is sign up for an ITIN number so they can show that they paid their taxes, knowing that they will never be able to get that money out because whatever they've paid into Medicaid, Social Security, taxes, they're not entitled to that money. A lot of Americans don't understand that point. And so closing the gap, the distance between who we are a mixed status country, and that is a reality that is a reality right now. And so I think that understanding each other, and then also opening the doors, what goes on in an immigration court. I think it's too easy to say, oh yeah, they'll have their day in court. But that was one of the reasons I left, because a lot of cases were already prejudged. There was no fair day in court. Their cases were decided before they even went there. And so I think understanding what the legal process is, how very little rights non-citizens have, and that how that affects us as a nation. I think those are important things to be clear on.
And finally, for you, Professor, we've had times when the Democrats have been in the White House, the Senate, and the Congress, and we still haven't made a lot of progress in terms of our immigration policies. No expectation that under this administration, with the Republican-controlled House and Senate, to have a Supreme Court stacked by Republican-leaning judges, conservative judges, and to have Trump in the White House. So not likely to get immigration reform in this administration. But looking ahead, what would immigration reform look like if we really did have a Democratic administration, Congress, and Senate that were going to really say we're going to change these laws so that we never have to go through this moment again in our history?
The first step is our political leaders knowing the reasons why people migrate in the first place, why people have to leave their countries. And there's a phrase that educators and activists say, people are here because we were there. And so the first step is understanding our own role and complicity in leading people to leave their families, leave their country of origin, and come to start over in a new place because of the political, social, economic, environmental degradation that is often driven by U.S. policies, by U.S. demand for goods, by exploitation that's already happening in people's countries of origin. People migrate to places where they have connections. People migrate to the places that are exploiting them from a larger political sense. And so that is really the first step in understanding why we have immigration in the first place. And the second thing is making sure that people who are here first, who've lived in this country, who are undocumented, have the opportunity to adjust their status, not just because of the fact that they've contributed to our tax base or because they're economic contributors or good citizens, but because it is the right thing to do for our country, for people who have lived here. And the third thing is making sure that we adjust our visa system. It is very unequal. It is very restrictive. It does not provide, on the one hand, the amount of workers at both ends of the labor market, in the low-wage labor market, in the high-end labor market, that this country requires to maintain ourselves in the economic landscape that we have created for ourselves. And so we need reform that is based in humanity, that is based in the realities of why people move from one place to another, and that is based in really understanding that the future of this country relies on immigrants and people of color. And that is one of the primary problems with immigration law in this country, is that it has usually been made to maintain the advantages of people who are already in power. And until we get our leaders to understand that and to fight for that, we are not going to see progressive and productive immigration reform in this country.
I'm glad you brought that up, Professor Veronica. In your experience working inside, immigration courts, working under 3 administrations, did you see a difference? Because we often think of immigrants, they want you to think of these racialized images of Latinos crossing the southern border from Mexico and, countries near Mexico. But so much of the discussion is focused there, whereas there are immigrants from other countries, particularly when we need nurses from the Philippines or we need engineers. There's a whole different conversation that takes place when you talk about those educated, skilled immigrants versus folks who are considered the unskilled workers. What are some of the differences that you saw in immigration courts and in our immigration policies in terms of how those different classes are treated?
And that's a really good point. If you look at the numbers for immigration court, it's 90% Spanish speakers. And so 90% of people who actually get put into immigration removal, who have been detained, they are coming from South America, Central America, the Latin American countries. And it's always been political. If you look at it, it's when the U.S. needs something that they extend a hand and they say, okay, we need nurses from these particular countries, but they're all temporary visas. Unless someone, once they get here, can find a way to make that permanent, they're temporary. And once their usefulness to the U.S. has run out, then they can say, okay, now we're going to put you into immigration proceedings and start a removal process, start this deportation process against you. And so at Humanizing, one of my biggest points is non-citizens need rights. There has to be this right for non-citizens that no matter who the president is, they have this fundamental rights that cannot be changed. And I think that is, for me, the message I really want to get across, because it's not right that we can extend a hand when we need it and then slap them the minute that we don't.
How can people find you, Veronica, particularly people who have questions about their own status or questions about, are they the subject of deportation, or just generally questions about their legal rights?
So they can follow me on Instagram at Humanizing. I also have a website, humanizing.org, and I do try to do as many educational videos so that people can empower themselves. And it's not easy when immigration, ICE, ERO, CBP come up to you, they're armed, they're not nice, right? They're shouting. And so to have that level of of secureness and knowing that these are their rights and they can advocate for themselves.
Well, thank you. And I hope, again, that people will take you up on that offer, follow you on social media, go to your website, get those videos, because we know knowledge is power. And the more knowledge you have about this process, the more powerful you will feel if you have one of these encounters with ICE agents or anyone of law enforcement or anyone from law enforcement who is seeking to arrest or detain you. Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining on this very important conversation. I am so happy to hear you say, Professor Vallejo, that there are activists all over this state, and hopefully that's being duplicated all over this country, who are standing up for the rights of immigrants, standing up for the rights of undocumented people. We know oftentimes those protests are not being televised on traditional news sites, but you're on the ground, so you're here to give us firsthand accounts that these protests are happening. I've been saying ever since Trump was elected, the resistance needs to take place in the streets. Obviously, it has to take place in the courts, and individuals need to figure out what role they can play. I know there's a lot of right now discontentment with our political structure, the Democratic Party in particular. People are asking, where's that charismatic leader? And I'm saying to folks, figure out what you can do. We all have power. We all have platforms. We all have things that we can do in our own families, in our own communities, to be a part of this resistance. Every voice is needed. No voice is too small. No platform is too small in this moment. And it's going to be the work of millions and millions of Americans individually moving and working in a collective way that will save our democracy, hopefully, and also help us get to a place where we have more humane policies for undocumented workers and immigrants in this country. Again, thank both of you for your insights. Stay informed, contact your representatives, and make your voice heard. All right, y'all. I'll see you next time. If you want more information about the special report, follow me across all social platforms at Areva Martin. Subscribe to my YouTube page and share the special report.
Calling all BIPOC college students, recent college graduates, and clinicians. Here's my story about CORE, a unique workforce development program that is changing lives. My brother is the most caring person you'll ever meet. With his autism diagnosis, my family had to fight to make sure that the resources he deserved were available. That's why my goal has always been to help children with developmental disabilities and give them chances my brother may have missed. So when I heard about the CORE Fellowship, I knew immediately it was for me. The fellowship opens doors for myself and others like me. They offer training, a stipend while you're learning, job placement, and they'll pay up to $10,000 of my student loan debt. The CORE Fellowship is going to allow me to achieve my life's purpose. They care about me, so I can care about others, like my brother. Visit the website to learn more about the CORE Fellowship. Discover your core passion, your power, and your purpose. Apply today.